Okay, all set. Cold weather. Lost my train of thought already. Not a good start. Let's see. Were there any questions I could answer before we dig in today? Okay. All right. Well, what I was thinking we'd talk about today, and I don't think it'll be a terribly long subject, partially because it's just not a subject I'm tremendously good at, is I wanted to talk a little bit about deployment and hosting of Rails websites. Right? So far, we've of course been working with Rails applications that we develop strictly on our own computers, which is super wonderful. It's fine, it's easy, it's great for when we're actually doing development, but generally, of course, the idea is that eventually at some point our application will reach a state of readiness where we are ready to release it upon the world, let other people be able to see it and use it and do all those wonderful sorts of things. So how do we take our Rails app and actually make it available across the greater internet, make it available to other people? Right? Well, there's a lot of different factors that play into this, and I have to admit this is by far one of my least favorite subjects. It's tricky. There's a million different options. There's a lot of things that can go wrong, and at least for me, it's not something that I tend to do every day. You know, spend 6 months or a year developing a site and then 2 or 3 days deploying it, and then it's 6 months to a year developing some other site and then a few days deploying it. So it seems like it's something that only comes up every so often, so I don't get as much practice at it as I would like. I don't feel like I'm launching a website every other day, so I don't have sort of the built-in reflex to fix all the problems that typically occur. Every time I do it, it feels like it's the first time again, right? But anyway, I thought I'd start off by talking a little bit about the actual hosting options that are available, each one of which tends to kind of have its good points and its bad points. Right? Starting off at the top of my little list I made here, which is self-hosting. Right? In self-hosting, basically what the idea would be was that you own the computer, you keep the computer yourself, you set the computer up, you have full control over the computer, the server that we're deploying to here. Right? So imagine a situation where you take an old computer, you load Linux on it, and you stick it up in the top of a bathroom closet or something like that. You've got your internet home access, you've got it plugged into your home electrical, right? That's certainly a possibility. You could set the computer up to behave, to act any way that you potentially want, set it up so that it can run your Rails applications. There's a sort of deceptive attractiveness, I think, to that basic idea, not having to mess with anything else. It's just right here, you know, is what it all comes down to. No extra costs. I've already got everything I need, right? The trick is self-hosting is usually a very, very bad idea, especially if it's any kind of website that you expect to have any sort of importance that people are going to want to be able to see regularly. You want it to have good uptime. You want it to be available. Certainly if you are trying to make money or sell subscriptions to it or anything like that, you want it to be available as absolute much as it can. And in a home hosting sort of situation, that's usually not best. You know, the electricity goes out at your house, your internet access goes out. That means no website, right? Your server can't be accessed in those kinds of situations. It means that, you know, in the worst case situation, something actually happens to your house burns down, right? Website's gone too. That's not good, right? It also generally doesn't offer tremendously good performance. Even though a lot of people will go home in the evening and get on their home internet and go, wow, this is fast, this works real well. You have to keep in mind that most home internet connections are asymmetrical. They offer much, much faster downloads than they do uploads. Now, for when we're at home surfing on our connection, that's great because most of what we're doing is downloading web pages, downloading files, downloading movies, downloading content of different types. But if you had a web server running from your house and other people were trying to access it, they would be pulling web pages out of your connection, which would essentially constitute an upload. So they would be working at those much, much slower upload speeds. So you would never get tremendously good performance out of a website that you were trying to host from your house, right? So hosting at home is usually not a super practical solution. If you wanted it to be practical, you would probably need a backup power generator for home. You'd probably need some fancier ways of handling disasters, fires and floods, things like that. You would probably need backup internet connections. You would have to pay a lot more for your internet connections because you would want them to at least be symmetrical so you could get decent performance out of it. Basically what you would be doing is you'd be paying a lot of money to turn your house into a data center, right? Which is probably not the most effective way to go, right? Which is what the second option basically is then, co-location. Right? Co-location basically would be you own the computer, you're in complete control of it, just like you would be if you had the computer there in your house. The only difference is you don't keep the computer there in your house. You rent out a space in a data center, essentially somewhere, where you can then have your computer probably installed in a rack, hooked up to their power, hooked up to their internet connections, all of which were set up specifically with the idea that they would be used for hosting websites, hosting software, doing those sorts of things. So all the extra money that you wouldn't want to have to spend beefing up your house to turn it into a data center, all of that money has already been spent setting up a data center, which you could then rent your little place in if you happen to want to. There's a million different places that do co-location, right, that you can contact, get different, lots of different rates are available depending on how much money you want to spend. Certainly one that I've always been keeping my eye on, I haven't pulled the trigger and actually used it because of the upfront cost, is a place called Mac Mini Colo. Right? Basically what you can do is buy or rent a little Mac Mini size of a couple of slices of bread, and this Mac Mini Colo place will co-locate it for you, basically have it stored in their data center, and so you can have this nice little Mac server running your website for you if that's what you want. So lots of different co-location options, right? Another option you have for hosting that's still along that same sort of vein, right, is a dedicated server. With a dedicated server, it's still the same sort of basic situation, the one big difference being that you no longer own the server itself. With self-hosting, with co-location, the server itself is physically yours. You bought it. It is your piece of hardware. When, on the other hand, you rent a dedicated server, it is somebody else's hardware, but you will be paying to get exclusive use of it, is generally the way it works. Right? So with a dedicated server, you would contact some company that makes this kind of service available. They would have a server in a rack in a data center somewhere. You would probably pay them a monthly, yearly fee to be able to use that server. You would be able to contact it remotely, administer it. The way it was set up, the way it's configured, the way it behaves is completely and utterly under your control, usually within the stipulations of whatever guideline the company that leased you the thing set up, right? But it's still that same basic situation. So if you want to host a Rails website, you host a Rails website. If you want to host something else, you host something else. It's all completely up to you, right? The real trick with dedicated servers, right, co-location and self-hosting for that matter too, is that all three of those tend to be the most expensive way to go. Right? With all three of those, right, we're talking about basically buying an extra computer. The first two, that's very direct. The third one with dedicated servers, the buying of the extra computer is more like a leasing of a computer, but nevertheless it does end up being costly. Right? With all three of those, you also end up being in full control, though, of the server. So you're not answering to anybody else. It's not up to somebody else to decide what you can or can't do with that server. It is completely in your control, right? But the cost can be intimidating, right? The next option I have on the list then is what's called VPS hosting. VPS stands for Virtual Private Server. And essentially the way VPS works is that instead of you paying a lot of money to lease your own server all by yourself, instead what happens with VPS hosting is that you pay less money to lease a part of a server. Other parts of that server are leased by other people. So basically you're sharing a server with others, which helps sort of offset some of the cost of something like dedicated hosting, right? The neat thing about VPS hosting, though, is that from our point of view, when we connect to the server, the entire server appears to be ours. Right? That's why it's called a virtual private server. Even though the hardware itself is being shared, right? Every user who's using that server gets a certain percentage of the processing capability, a certain percentage of the memory, a certain percentage of the storage. The software itself is virtualized. So when I go and I log into my VPS hosting server, right, it looks to me, from my perspective, as if I am the only one using that server because I'm logging into my own dedicated virtual machine on that piece of hardware, which other people can then also do, log into their own virtual private servers, which are running on the same computer as mine, right? So this is a very interesting and attractive option, VPS hosting, because it costs potentially far, far less than a dedicated server, but it still gives you the same potential for being able to do your own setup, your own configuration, right? Being able to host things, configure things, run things, essentially any way that you decide that you want to, right? Not being at the, not having your setup be at the discretion of some other company, some other group, some other person. It's entirely up to you, but without the enormous cost of dedicated, co-located, or self-hosting. Does that make sense? Right? I think it's mostly because of a lot of the pluses and the few minuses that go along with VPS hosting that it's gotten to be really pretty popular nowadays. There's lots of different places that do this sort of thing. Certainly one that's very common is a place called Linode. Right? Linode specializes in this VPS type hosting. Right? They've got a nice website, lots of good stuff you can read about out there. Basically what I wanted to do was just show you a few prices just so you could kind of get an idea of what we're talking about here. Right? Their smallest VPS system, right? You get a gigabyte of RAM, right? The equivalent of 8 CPU. Is that an 8-core CPU? I'm not even sure. Right? 24 gigabytes of storage, 2 gigabyte data transfer, and that's for $20 a month. Still a bit of a price though, isn't it? And that's pretty cheap as far as a lot of things go. Right? If you wanted to talk about something like dedicated hosting, here's a place I use occasionally. Oh, they used to do dedicated hosting. Do they not anymore? Oh, they might have discontinued it. They do VPS now, though. Oh well, I was going to see if I could just real quickly find a price for some dedicated hosting for you, but I'm not going to Google around for it. It'll take too long. Alright, but anyway, VPS hosting. There's another place that I've been keeping my eye on lately called DigitalOcean. DigitalOcean, again, is like Linode in that it does VPS type hosting. The thing that really intrigues me about them, for starters, is that instead of standard storage, they use all SSDs, which is a big performance boost. Right? So it tends to be fast. The other thing that's really nice about them is the price. They mention here $5 a month. Right? I was trying to find a little bit more detail. $5 a month, you get 512 meg of memory, a single CPU core, 20 gigabyte SSD disk, a terabyte of transfer, right? Which overall isn't quite as much as what Linode gives you, but this is a quarter of the price. So a pretty attractive potential option there. I'm thinking about over the summer maybe taking my website and moving it over to this, see how it works. Right? Oh yeah, for this they also charge hourly if you want. 7/1000th of a cent per hour for the bottom tier if you want. Right? That's kind of an interesting idea in a way because it means that you could potentially use them just for experimentation and play. You could basically build up a server, create a virtual private server with them, use it for a day or two, and then shut it back down when you were done fiddling with it or when you weren't using it, so that the clock didn't keep running on the cost. So you could end up potentially paying cents a month, depending on how much use you were actually putting into that server. Kind of a neat idea. Okay. So VPS hosting, right? Now, with VPS, dedicated co-location, self, with all those different types of hosting, I mentioned now numerous times that you are completely and fully in control, right? It is essentially completely up to you to decide everything. How to set the box up, all the way from what operating system you want to run, to what web server you want to run, how it's going to be configured, everything is completely up to you. Usually this is all done through remote connections, right? If you haven't had a Linux class or you're not familiar with working on the command line, it's a really good idea because that's basically how you're probably going to end up doing all this sort of stuff. You're going to secure shell, SSH, into your server and then working from the command line, install, set up, and configure everything you need in order to make the server work for your purposes, right? That by itself can be kind of a daunting challenge. There's certainly a lot of documentation out there. Most of the VPS places I was showing you have their own little documentation farms, in a way, that describe on their particular service how to do a lot of common things, how to install such and such version of Linux, how to set up the web server, how to set up DNS, how to set up a mail server, all of those different kinds of things. So there's certainly no lack of documentation, but you have to at least be able to get out on the command line, do some basic things, and kind of have the guts in a way to go out there and chip away at it until you can get all of those little bits and pieces working. In my experience, very rarely is it flawless. There's always some version of this or that that's changed, and end up spending a lot of time in Google looking for solutions to different problems that might come up. Right? I don't know about you, that's not my favorite thing in the world. I like the coding. I like the programming aspect of it. I'm not all that big of a fan of becoming a server administrator. Right? It is something that I'm kind of growing to accept that, hey, whether I like it or not, I probably need to be doing more of it. You know, I think a lot of the problems that one of my websites has right now is basically because I've done everything I can to try to avoid having to do much in the way of administration of the server myself, right? But one way or another, not my favorite thing, right? So there is another potential option, managed hosting, right? Managed hosting a lot of times goes along with VPS, the idea basically being that it's still essentially a VPS type system, but you essentially turn over control of your VPS to some dedicated administrator who then sets things up, configures, monitors, backs up, does all those sorts of things for you, right? It usually, of course, adds to the cost if they're not just giving you essentially a blank VPS instance and you're taking care of everything from there, but you're instead expecting them to dedicate some of their work hours to keeping your box up and running, configured, updated, secure. Then you, of course, end up paying a little bit of extra money for it. Right? One of the places that comes to mind that I believe offers managed hosting is a place called Engine Yard. Right? Engine Yard's one you should keep your eye on because they very specifically specialize in Ruby on Rails development. So they're very good at, very knowledgeable about setting up servers specifically for working with Rails applications. Right? Some of their options, let's see, let's look at Engine Yard Cloud. You know, a lot of times when people talk about cloud, essentially what they are talking about is VPS. That's really kind of what cloud boils down to. I hate that term, cloud, because it's essentially by itself meaningless. There is no magical cloud out there. Right? There are VPS servers, which is what most people are talking about when they talk about the cloud. Right? The trick with a VPS server, the thing that makes it sort of cloud-like, is the fact that you can create new ones so quickly and easily. So if I went out to one of these different VPS providers, like DigitalOcean that I was talking about, I could set up a VPS for running my Rails app. Right? I could also then back that up and clone it. So if I needed to one day start up a second server to also run my Rails site, I could do that within a matter of seconds, virtually. That's basically what cloud is all about. Right? Anyway, here at Engine Yard, I was trying to find information about their managed hosting. Is all their stuff managed? Self-service, scaling, monitoring, alerting, cloning, snapshots, backup. I don't know. You can go look through this stuff yourself. I won't try to read it to you, right? But that's a term, let's at least say, that you might run into when you're looking for hosting solutions. Oh boy, that's corporate speak, isn't it? Right? When you're looking for some way to host a Rails app, a term you certainly might run into is managed hosting, basically meaning that they will do most of the server admin work for you, which is nice because that can be an awful pain in the neck, but you pay for it, just like with anything else. Right? What I have down here sort of then at the close to the bottom of the list is shared hosting. Okay? Shared hosting is kind of, to me, one of the most old-fashioned ways to host. Shared hosting is where you literally are sharing a server with probably many other people. Right? Some company has a bunch of servers set up. They rent out little chunks of that servers. They are not VPSs. When you actually go onto that server, it is quite painful and obvious that that server is being shared between a great number of different people. Right? The server itself is completely and wholly managed by whoever actually owns the server. You are given typically barely enough permissions to be able to get your application uploaded and working in most cases. Right? I'm not a super big fan of shared hosting, mostly because of that more openly shared aspect of it. Since everybody is kind of actively competing for resources, it means that if one person's website is messing up, overusing the database so that the database keeps dropping out, overusing the web server so it's unable to respond, then your website suffers. Right, because everybody is completely sharing everything. There's only one copy, there's one database running, there's one web server running, and you have 1,000 different websites on that server who are all sharing it. Right? When you go to shared hosting, it is of course completely managed. Right? So you can barely do anything. That also can potentially lead to the issue that you might not always have the versions of the software on that server that you want. Right? So, for example, what was it, yesterday? They released the first preview of Rails 4. Right? Well, maybe you want to update your website so that it starts running on this preview version of Rails 4. Not a good idea, by the way. Right? Well, if you're on shared hosting, tough. Right? If Rails 4 completely comes out and your shared host still is only supporting Rails 3, tough. You're stuck with Rails 3. So it's not really up to you to decide when and where you're actually going to do your upgrades. Right? I know some of the most stressful times that I've had occasionally was when I've had shared hosted websites and I got an email from the hosting company that said, hey, by the way, we're updating Ruby tomorrow. Right? It's like, oh, good, wonderful. So then there's this mad dash scramble to make sure that all the sites that I have hosted on there are going to work okay once Ruby is upgraded. So you've got to upgrade to that new version of Ruby on your own machine. Hopefully you have a test suite. You can run your tests, hope everything works. If it doesn't, you're fixing stuff all night long. And then, of course, when they actually do roll out the update, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, and you spend a couple days sitting there trying to get everything working again, with a fairly minimal amount of control, since there's not usually a whole lot that you can actually do on a shared hosting system. Right? So anyway, shared hosting, though, isn't all bad. Right? If you don't want to mess with having to manage a server with shared hosting, you generally won't have to. Right? It also tends to be the cheapest. Shared hosting can be ridiculously cheap. Right? So there are some advantages to it, and I certainly have used it. No doubt about it. What do you think so far? All right, with pretty much everything VPS and up, where you're basically in charge of setting up your own server, that's going to mean, like I said, that you're going to have to install your own operating system. Most all the time that is going to be some version of Unix or Linux, right? So those are definitely good things to know. It means that you're going to need to run your own web server. Since we're basically talking about running a website here, you're going to have a web server one way or another. Certainly the most common web server in use nowadays is the Apache web server. Right? There is a module available for the Apache web server that will allow Apache to run Rails websites. It's called Fusion Passenger. I don't know if you remembered back in PHP, for example, or even if we did it this way when you guys took that class. But we would install Apache, and then we would install PHP, and then in Apache we'd have to go and enable a little connection between Apache and PHP. Well, that's kind of what Fusion Passenger does, but it connects Apache to Rails. It lets Apache recognize when a Rails application is present so that Apache can take requests and forward them on to your Rails stack so that the request can be dealt with, the request can be satisfied, and then the response sent back to the user again when everything was done. One of the interesting things about Rails, though, is that Apache certainly isn't the only option. There are quite a few other servers that are also available that can be used to host Rails websites. There's a server that I hear a lot of people talk about, seems to be quite popular, called Puma, P-U-M-A. Google for Puma Rails. There it is. Little open source project. Simple, fast, and highly concurrent HTTP1 server for Ruby web applications. All right, so that's an interesting possibility. All right. There's a Unicorn. Basically another HTTP server, another web server meant specifically for Rails type applications. Actually, this one I think works with other types too, but Rails also works. What else is there? Nginx, Nginx, pronounced Nginx, is another one that's very popular in Rails circles for hosting Rails websites. Their own website doesn't seem to be terribly responsive. Oh, there it goes. Right. So, various other options besides Apache. Right? The one thing you definitely do not want when you actually deploy a Rails website is you don't want to use the little built-in WebBrick server like we use in development. That little WebBrick server is just fine, even better than fine probably for development, but it was never intended to be a production scale web server. Right? It has problems with concurrency, multiple requests at a time. Right? It's not really tuned for performance all that much. Right? So using just Rails S, like we have been in class, is not something you would actually want to do when you actually deploy your site for others to be able to use. You would want to go with one of these other servers, something much more robust, much more capable of dealing with the traffic that your website hopefully would end up getting. Okay? Same issue with databases. In development, the little database system that comes with Rails is SQLite. I think it's SQLite 3 currently. Right? Again, works just fine for development, but not production quality. Right? Generally. Some people might argue with me there, but in general. Typically, when you actually deploy a website, you want a more production level type database server. Something like MySQL has been popular with Rails in production for quite a few years. Works very well. Right? More and more, though, lately, people have been moving over towards a different database server called Postgres. Right? Postgres is another MySQL contemporary, another database server sort of on that same level. Production quality can do just fine keeping up with a full-blown, popular, heavily used Rails application. Okay. Usually setting up these other web servers or these other database servers becomes another one of those system administration type tasks, actually installing the web server, the database server, onto the server itself. Getting Rails to then communicate through or with that web server, that database server, is usually just a matter of installing the proper gems. It's usually pretty easy from the Rails side to be able to get that sort of thing working. Okay? All right. I have listed down here at the bottom then, other. Right? There are some interesting additional options when it comes to doing things like hosting Rails websites, besides the more traditional options, the ones I listed before. Right? One of them that I've been keeping a really close eye on, I'm really excited about, is a thing called Action.io, or at least that's what it used to always be called. It looks like they've changed their name to Nitrous.io now. Right now they are in early public beta, so they are absolutely in no way ready to do this for real, but they've got their setup up out there so that people can start playing with it. Right? And essentially what you can do is it's a bit like a VPS type solution. What I have here in my account that I already have set up is I've already created one virtual server I called Railsbox. If I wanted to create another server, it would just be a matter of clicking new box and telling it what kind of setup I want for it. So I could say I want it to be a Ruby on Rails box, and it would already then have a good server, a good database, right? All the basics that I need installed for me there. Right? That's all good and interesting. That's all pretty basic VPS type stuff though. What I think is particularly interesting about Action.io, Nitrous.io, right, is that once you actually do get your box set up, they then have a completely web-based IDE that you can use to interact with it. So right here in the browser, I have access to the server's command line down here at the bottom, where I can work in it just like I would in any other command line. I have a file browser over here at the side. I've already generated a little test app here, so you can see I actually have a little Rails app that I've put together. Right? And when you choose a file, you've got a built-in editor. Right? Pretty decent little editor too. One of the better editors that I've ever seen that was web-based. Right? Looks a whole lot like what I typically use on my own computer. Right? So essentially, they have a VPS with this sort of special front end on it so that you can actually do all of your development right there on the server itself. This would mean that you don't have to mess with setting up Ruby, setting up Rails, setting up database. You wouldn't have to do anything really on your local computer at all. Everything you do for developing a Rails site could potentially be done out there on a server live. Right? Now, of course, that's not the way you would want to treat customers. You wouldn't want to say, hey, here's my website. By the way, I'm still working on it minute by minute. But since you can start up multiple instances, you could start up one box where you do development, set up another box where you're going to do production, do all of your work on the development box. Once you've got it working on the development box the way you want, you clone it over to the production box, and that's the one whose URL you actually publish as your website. Right? It's a really neat idea, I think. Very neat idea. Right? The thing that I find most exciting about it is I think it would be really, really neat if you could do things like develop a Rails website without actually having a computer. What if you could just develop an entire Rails application from your cell phone or from a tablet? Well, this has that potential. It's about the only thing that I've ever seen that really has that potential. But I find it very, very exciting. Right? Unfortunately, at the moment, it works great from a desktop browser. From a mobile browser, pretty lousy. The experience is not very good. Right? The file editor works real well, but the command line works very, very poorly. Right? Has a lot of trouble deciding when to show the virtual keyboard, when not to show the virtual keyboard. Right? I'm not knocking them. They are in very early private beta, and they are getting feedback from people. I know that I've certainly sent in a lot of feedback about how it works on a tablet because I think that's the most exciting aspect of it. Right? But with something like this, I don't even know exactly how to categorize it. It is something brand new and completely different. It has a lot of aspects of a lot of different things, and I think it's a really exciting direction for things to go in the future. So, pretty cool. Yeah. Another very cool option available is a place called Heroku. Heroku.com. Right? Heroku basically got their start specializing in hosting Rails web applications. They host lots of other things now in addition to Rails, but they still do Rails and still do it very well. Right? The way they basically kind of got popular is because through their specialization of Rails, they were able to come up with an extremely simple and fairly easy to handle deployment strategy. Right? So something not quite like a VPS, because I don't really have full control over a virtual server, but something a little bit like that in that the resources are kind of handled as if it was a virtual server situation. Other people's websites should not really interfere with the performance or availability of resources for my website. It's really, again, another one of those things that's almost completely different than any of those other solutions. It's difficult to even describe, right? I can tell you overall, though, one of the neatest things about Heroku is the way that they deal with scaling, right? Scaling is kind of a wonderful problem to have. Scaling is something that you would run into in a situation where you've launched your website, it's running from a server, but it's getting so popular, it's being used so much that that server simply doesn't have enough resources to be able to keep up with the demand that's being put on it. So if you run into that kind of problem, right, basically your website is so popular it's grinding your server to dust, what do? Well, first thing you've got to do is you've got to figure out where the bottlenecks are. Right? What is it that is running out? Where is the resources running out? Is it the web server that's clogging up first? Is it the database server that can't keep up? Right? Once you kind of figure out what the problem is, there are some sort of halfway strategies that you can do to help mitigate them. There's code optimization. You can go through and change things about the way your application is really written to try to streamline flow through those different bottlenecks in better ways. Right? There's also potentially things like caching or proxies, where you can have less processing done by having some third-party piece of software be able to handle some portion of the load that's being put onto your web server, put onto your application. Right? But usually, hopefully, if you're lucky, you eventually get to a point where your site is so popular that once everything's optimized, once you're doing some good caching, some good proxy work, you may still have the need to actually put into service additional servers. So basically, you've grown to a point where a single server just isn't enough to be able to host your website anymore. You might need additional servers to run additional implementations of the application itself. You might need additional web servers. You might need additional database servers. Millions and millions of different ways those things could all be potentially broken up and set up, right? All of them are quite complicated, in my opinion, right? Not a lot of fun, in my opinion, right? And that's another one of those places where I think Heroku is really neat, right? The way Heroku is set up is they don't even really talk about servers. They don't want you to think about servers. What they do is they say you have these things called dynos, D-Y-N-O. Right? Essentially, a dyno is kind of like a running copy of your program, a running copy of your website. Right? It doesn't matter if it's on a server, if it's on 10 servers, or what. All they say you need to know is you have a dyno. If you have one dyno, you can run one copy of your website. It's kind of like having a single server, essentially one process to handle the load coming to your website. But they then have it set up so just sliding a little bar, right, on the website or running a little command on the command line can increase the number of dynos where they automatically scale out your application for you. They can do that for the application itself. They can do that for the database. Right? So they make things like scaling quite a bit easier. Right? I could show you here an application that I have out here with Heroku. When I actually go to it, right now what I have for this application is I have one dyno. That's all it needs, right? Because it gets like 3 hits a month, so one dyno is more than enough. But if it suddenly became extremely popular and that one dyno couldn't keep up with the traffic, all I have to do is click and drag this bar over, and I could add virtually as many dynos as I want, right? You can also create background workers. So background workers would be like little automated programs for running our rake tasks in the background like we talked about last week. Again, if I don't need any or if I need many, it's just a matter of sliding the control back and forth. Right? Their pricing is also pretty neat. Right? As long as you have one worker or one dyno and no workers, Heroku is free. So it's another place where you can tinker for basically no money. As long as you're not putting together anything too big, too fancy that requires more than a single dyno or some background workers, then you can set up an account with Heroku and use it for no money whatsoever, right? The way this application is running right now, for example, doesn't cost me anything. It's out there. If people start coming to it, then I could potentially have to scale it up, which would be very easy, and then I would have to start to pay. But as long as the site's kind of sitting out there idle with not much traffic to it, doesn't cost me a dime, right? So not too bad. Okay. Of all the different options for hosting, for deploying that are available, I think Heroku is the one that I ought to at least be able to demonstrate for you. Just kind of give you a little idea of how it actually works. Okay. Basically what I could do is go to my list of applications. You of course have to have created an account with Heroku. Once you do that though, when you actually go into your account, they list all of your applications here and there's a link to create a new app. If I click that, right, it gives me a place where I can then choose a name for my new application. If I don't pick a name, they'll actually pick one for me, and I like them to pick them for me because I find the names very pleasing. Right? So I'm just going to leave it blank, tell it I want it hosted in the United States, not Europe, and I'll just tell it create the new app for me. So my new app's then created. Right? It's actually going to be called Stark Depths 1205. See, I love their names. They're very zen. Not really, I guess, but one way or another. Okay? All right. The way Heroku then manages actually uploading your site to Heroku works entirely through a thing called Git, G-I-T, which we've never talked about. Right? But it's, again, a very, very popular tool, source control tool, basically to help you keep track of the code for your applications as you write them. Right? A lot of times, people who don't know Git, I describe it to them as saying, you know, you write a program, and then it works, and then one day you're going to make a giant change to that program. So what do? Well, you make a copy of the file, and you call that one version 1, and now version 2, and you make your big change. And if the big change dies for some reason, you can always just go back to the old copy of your file, right? Well, basically Git does that for you, except it just doesn't copy a file at a time. Essentially, potentially, if you want, every line of code you write can essentially be kept track of, so you can always roll back to older versions if something happens to have gone wrong, right? So anyway, Heroku uses that kind of idea. It basically assumes that any application that we're going to work with, we are going to have set up with source control, right? And they give me this little Git URL right here. What I can actually do, well, actually, they give me the whole command right here. If I take that command, jump over to my console, let me switch to my desktop. If I paste in and run their command, it's essentially calling out to their server and cloning, making a duplicate copy of what I have out there for my application right now. And you can see it says you appear to have cloned an empty repository. Well, yes, I sure have, because that application was just created and there's nothing in it, right? But if I take a look, right, I do have a directory now that it's created for me that's automatically a part of source control. Everything's already all set up to have it sync with Heroku. And I could, at that point, go ahead and build a new Rails application there if I want. So I could start a new Rails application into that Stark Depths 1205 directory. There we go. I change directories over to it, and everything's there. Basic Rails app all set up and ready to go. Okay. To make it work with Heroku, there's, I want to say, just one little change that I think I need to make. Over in my gem file, okay, we of course are set up by default to use SQLite 3. Well, Heroku doesn't use SQLite 3. Heroku uses a database called Postgres. there's a gem available for it just called PG. So if I replace the SQLite gem with the PG gem, then at that point I should be basically compatible with Heroku. Okay. If I was going to go ahead and do development on my local computer, okay, I could go ahead and install Postgres on my local computer and use it here too. Overall, that would be the smartest thing to do, but not the simplest, because I would have to install and set up and configure Postgres. Okay. So even though that's the smartest thing to do, what I do a lot of times, which is not as smart, is I create a development group and I put SQLite into that, right? So that essentially I can continue using SQLite while I'm doing development and not have to worry about installing Postgres on my own computer. But Postgres is still there for Heroku, for when I actually deploy it. All right. Jump back over to my console. I'm going to run bundle install. Right. That'll make sure that that PG gem is installed. Right. It also updates my GemfileLock, which is important, because what will happen is when I actually take my application and upload it to Heroku, Heroku, because it knows Rails applications, will know to automatically read the GemfileLock and automatically install all the necessary gems for my application for me. Right? I also need to go ahead and take what I have in my application right now and I need to commit it to my Git repository. So I'm going to say git add dot, which basically means add everything that's changed, which at this point is pretty much everything. And then I'm going to go ahead and commit, which means actually sort of check in all of those changes. I'll just say initial commit with I'm going to say PG for Heroku. There we go. So I've just kind of updated source control so that everything is checked in. So when I actually am ready to send it up to Heroku, all that stuff will be part of what's sent. Right. Everything in the application right now is essentially being tracked. All right. We should do something with this application other than just having it be a welcome to Rails thing. Let's go ahead and do Rails G scaffold. Let's do superheroes. I'll say every superhero has a hero name, has a secret name, and has a weakness, all of which are strings. There we go. All right. I might go ahead and check that stuff in. Added superhero scaffold. All right, now all that stuff's being tracked. All right. Eventually I get my application to a point where I'm ready to actually upload it to Heroku. Right? I should be able to do that by just saying get push Heroku master. I'm not telling it that Heroku is my master. The master part there is referring to the master branch of my application. One of the things that Git will let you do is make branches, basically take your application and split it off so you can take different directions with it, see which one works better this way, which one works better that way. I'm just saying here that what I want to do is I want to upload, I want to push to Heroku my main application here, my master application. So it takes and starts sending all of the data from my application up to Heroku. You see Heroku is smart. It detected already that this is a Ruby on Rails app. Given that it's a Ruby on Rails app, it basically knows where everything is supposed to be. So it's going through and automatically running bundler, installing all of the gems that are listed in my gemfile.lock.
What did the git commit do?
Easiest way to explain it is in Get, I guess there are 3 different states that a file can be in. They could be completely untracked, right? They could be tracked but not actually made a part of the repository, right? Or they could be a part of the repository. When you do the git add, you're taking it essentially from untracked to tracked but not part of the repository. When you do git commit, you're taking that second step and saying, don't just track it, actually make it a part of my official repository. I am far from being an expert in git immersion. What I would recommend if you're interested, is this the one? Come on, internet. There's a website, I think it's called Git Immersion. That basically is split up into little lessons that you can go through that teach you all the fundamentals of Git. Yeah, this is the one. Gitimmersion.com. It's a neat little thing. Neat little website. They do a good job. Okay, so anyway, when I uploaded to Heroku, it recognized it was a Rails app. It went through it, installed all my gems. It also went out and it automatically wrote its own database YAML file, right? So that we would correctly be accessing the database they have set up for us. It automatically pre-compiled all of our assets. So our CSS files, our JavaScript files all got compiled down so that they can be served efficiently, right? Essentially everything we needed got done for us automatically, right? So our application should be out there now, right? Heroku has their own gem, the Heroku tool belt, it's called, right? Using that Heroku gem, you can actually give different commands, like I can say Heroku open, and what it'll do is it will automatically open that application over in my web browser for me. So there it is running from Stark Depths 1205. If I go to /superheroes there at the end, it tells me something went wrong, right? In development, we typically would see a detailed error message here about what was wrong, but in production, it hides those detailed error messages and presents something like this instead, right? If we want to know what actually went wrong, then we can use the Heroku gem again. I can say Heroku log. I got to spell it right though. Or is it logs? Let me try logs, plural. And basically what it'll do is it'll go and show me the last, I don't know how many lines from the log file. Right? And as I peek through there, I see things like this. Invalid statement. Relation superheroes does not exist. Right? Well, what didn't I do? I never migrated my database, did I? Right? If I need to migrate my database or run any other rake task type command out on Heroku, I can say Heroku run, and then I could do something like rake db migrate. So it's essentially just like running a rake command on my own computer in development, except here the Heroku gem lets me go out and actually run it on my dyno, I guess we could say. A lot of output there, but deprecation warnings, just different versions of things they're using. It does say superheroes migrated down there at the bottom, so I think it's okay. If I come back over and try superheroes again, yep, sure enough. So my website's up and running now. So I can say Superman, Clark, Green Rocks, There we go. We created him. Can I edit him? Clark Kent. Yep, edited. So my application's up and running out there on Heroku. Not too bad. Let's see. Oh. Yeah. I guess the other thing I should say, just trying to be fair and balanced and all, is that Heroku is great, but it's maybe not all cherries and roses. There are some things about it that can be a little bit bothersome at times. One of those things is when you're running one dyno, what happens is they monitor that one free dyno you get, and if it isn't used for a certain period of time, they unload it and store it away. Right? That doesn't mean they delete your application. They just take it out of the active, ready-to-respond state that it's in. And then what happens is that if a request comes in for it, they then have to go retrieve your slug, they call it, your application again, load it back up so that it's able to respond. So something you'll notice with Heroku, especially when, something you'll notice with them when you're running just a single free dyno is that if you walk away and leave your website for a while, when you come back and hit refresh or pull it back up, it might take it 30 seconds to respond. It can be really slow, right? Once it's loaded back up, it'll work just fine. It'll be quick, no problem, virtually no lag at all, right? But there is sort of that first request penalty that goes along with running that one free dyno. So you want to watch out for that. All right? The one other little niggly thing I have with Heroku, right, is that they do not allow static storage. Which means if we wanted to run an app on Heroku that allowed file uploads, we're going to have a bit of a problem because they don't allow file uploads. Essentially, when you upload your site to them, they take your site and they turn it into this slug, like this compressed nugget that they can then move around from one dyno to another, store away, pull back up, anything they need to do. And that slug is only created when you deploy your application. It doesn't get recreated while the application is running, right? So if somebody were able to upload a file, where would that file go? It couldn't be a part of the slug. How would they store it? It's a bit of a problem from their point of view, so what they decided to do was just say, no, you can't upload things. You can't have static file storage as a part of your Heroku app, right? What you could do is you could sign up with some other service like Amazon S3, who specialize purely in file storage, and you could set up your application that's running on Heroku so that whenever something is uploaded, it instead actually gets sent over to the storage people, the S3 people, for example. That works fine, and the paperclip gem that we looked at a few weeks ago actually has really super easy support for that. Makes it a very easy thing to do. Right? But it is one more thing, you know. It is one other service you have to sign up for, one other thing you have to pay attention to, potentially one other bill you have to pay. Right? So Heroku overall is great. I like it a lot. Very happy with it. There are those couple of things, though, that you always kind of need to keep in mind. Right? Maybe one other thing is that their prices are not fantastic. Right? Once you actually do start moving past that one dyno, the prices go up very, very quickly. Very quickly. Right? So like I mentioned, for example, that I was thinking about moving my own website, my course site, over to DigitalOcean over the summer. Well, why not move it to Heroku? Right? Well, basically for a few reasons. One is that there's that performance penalty of having one dyno, or much, much higher prices if I go up to even just two, right? There's also the issue of when people upload things, when people upload assignments and such, where do I put them? Well, I'd have to sign up and put them somewhere else, put them over on Amazon or something like that, right? Something like DigitalOcean, the VPS solution I told you about. on one hand is going to be an enormous pain because I'm going to have to install, set up, configure, do everything to get that box up and running. But once it is up and running, I'll be able to do whatever I want with it. It'll be running all the time, so no performance penalty. I'll be able to have people upload files to it. I can manage the storage on my own. No additional account. Right? It's all trade-offs, isn't it? Yeah. Pretty much all trade-offs. Well, what do you think? Is there anything else I can tell you about hosting or about deployment? I'm afraid the answer might be no, I can't. Because like I said, it's not my strongest subject. But tell you anything I know? Oh, I made myself a note. There was one other thing I want to mention to you before we quit today. Rails 2 class. Right? I didn't put it on the schedule because this class was so small there wasn't really any chance in the world that a Rails 2 class was going to make. I wanted to point out, I didn't know if I'd ever shown you this before, but if you go to my website, go down to courses in the footer, it lists all the courses I teach. Rails 2 is listed there. And over here on the sidebar, I've got a link for course availability. What you can do is if you give me your email address there, or if you give your address to my website more appropriately, what will happen is in the future, the next time I add a Rails 2 course, it'll automatically email you and let you know that a Rails 2 course has been added. So there won't be one this coming semester, this coming fall or spring. But maybe this next fall or spring, if I get enough people through Ruby and through Rails 1, maybe there would be enough for the semesters after that. So it can be hard to remember that far in the future, which is why I put this feature in my website, so it can basically remember for you and let you know in the future if that class does happen to come up again. The one last thing we need then is we need to decide what we're going to do about next week. Next week is finals week. We're scheduled to take our final on Thursday. I believe that's the May the 9th, if I remember correctly. We're scheduled to have our final at our normal time, so 11 o'clock. Right? I, of course, wasn't going to give you a final, but if you wanted to meet that day and maybe talk about Ajax, right, we could do that. But if you don't want to meet next week, that's fine. I understand it is finals week. My feelings won't be hurt. It's up to you. So is today our last day of class, or will we be back one more time? One more time? All right. Let's plan on that then. It probably won't be a super long class again, but I think we'll take our to-do application and play with Ajax a little bit. I'll show you what I know. Right? And that's what we'll do. All right, guys. Have a great afternoon.